The funniest thing about that morning was that the police thought they were coming to remove me from someone else's neighborhood, when in reality they were about to witness the most expensive misunderstanding in Willow Creek history. The first thing I heard was the slow crunch of gravel under cruiser tires before I ever saw the flashing lights. The smell of freshly cut grass drifted across the quiet Texas morning while sprinklers clicked rhythmically along perfectly trimmed lawns that looked more like a magazine cover than a real neighborhood. I was halfway through unloading moving boxes from the back of my pickup when a white luxury golf cart stopped directly in front of my driveway. A woman stepped out wearing a spotless cream-colored blazer that somehow looked untouched by the dust blowing across the street. She folded her arms with the confidence of someone who had spent years believing every conversation ended exactly the way she expected. Behind her, 2 police officers climbed out of their patrol vehicle, calm, professional, and obviously unsure why they had been called to a man quietly unpacking books and kitchen supplies. The woman did not even introduce herself before speaking. "You cannot move into this property until you register with the Homeowners Association." Her voice carried across the street, drawing curtains open all around us. Curious neighbors appeared on front porches holding coffee mugs, pretending not to stare while watching every second unfold. I closed the tailgate of my truck and brushed the dust from my hands before answering. "I appreciate the concern, but I am not part of your homeowners association." The words landed like a dropped wrench inside a silent garage. Her confident smile disappeared for only a fraction of a second before returning even wider than before. "Everyone on this street belongs to the association," she replied. "If you refuse to cooperate, we will have no choice but to enforce our community rules." One of the officers looked toward me and asked politely if I owned the property. I nodded and handed him the closing documents for my house. He studied the paperwork carefully, then handed it back with a respectful nod. "Everything here appears to be in order, sir." Before I could answer, the woman interrupted him. "He is leaving out the important part. This neighborhood has mandatory membership." She pointed toward a decorative stone monument standing at the subdivision entrance where elegant bronze letters spelled out Willow Creek Estates. It looked impressive from a distance, polished and permanent, exactly the kind of landmark designed to convince people that authority came from expensive landscaping. I looked at the sign, then back at her. "I still am not in your homeowners association." This time she laughed loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "Then you can explain that to a judge." The officers exchanged another glance, clearly recognizing this was becoming a civil disagreement rather than a criminal matter. They remained patient while she insisted I was violating neighborhood regulation simply by unloading my belongings. What she could not possibly know was that less than 12 hours earlier I had signed a completely different stack of closing papers at a downtown title office. At the time, I believed I was purchasing a quiet commercial investment with reliable tenants already in place. I had not yet opened every page of the lease assignments included in that transaction. If I had, I probably would have smiled much sooner. Instead, I simply stood there listening to birds singing above the oak trees while the morning breeze carried the scent of fresh mulch across the neighborhood, wondering how long it would take before someone realized the person they were trying so desperately to remove was connected to them in a way none of us had fully understood yet. Nobody spoke for several seconds after the officers handed my paperwork back. The neighborhood suddenly felt much quieter than it had only moments earlier, as though even the sprinklers understood something unusual was unfolding. "My name is Nathan Brooks, and I have spent nearly 20 years investing in commercial real estate across Texas. Shopping centers, medical offices, warehouses, and small business complexes had always interested me more than luxury homes because buildings tell honest stories if you know how to read financial records instead of advertisements. My father owned a hardware store in a small town outside Austin, and he taught me that every contract deserved the same respect as a handshake because both represented trust. That lesson stayed with me long after I graduated from college and built my investment company one property at a time. I never chased headlines or risky deals. I preferred aging commercial buildings with dependable tenants who simply wanted a fair landlord that answered the phone when something needed fixing. A few weeks before moving into Willow Creek, my attorney called about an opportunity involving a small portfolio of commercial properties owned by a retiring investor. The package included several leased office buildings that generated steady income with long-term tenants already in place. Nothing about the transaction seemed extraordinary. We completed inspections, reviewed environmental reports, confirmed title insurance, and closed without surprises. I signed hundreds of pages during the closing appointment, thanked everyone around the conference table, and drove away believing I had simply added another ordinary investment to my portfolio. My decision to buy the nearby house had nothing to do with those commercial properties. After years of constant travel between projects, I wanted somewhere peaceful where mornings began with birds instead of traffic. The house sat just outside the recorded boundary of the Homeowners Association according to every survey and title document I reviewed before purchasing it. That detail mattered because I had no interest in neighborhood politics. I respected associations that stayed within their legal authority, but I also believed property rights should be defined by recorded documents instead of assumptions. Standing in my driveway that morning, I watched the woman continue explaining neighborhood rules with remarkable confidence while the officers listened patiently. She introduced herself as Victoria Holloway, president of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association, and spoke with the polished certainty of someone accustomed to winning disagreements before they truly began. Every sentence carried the same message. Everyone here answered to the association. Everyone followed the same rules. Everyone eventually complied. I thanked the officers for their professionalism and continued carrying boxes into my garage while Victoria warned that this issue was far from over. The smell of fresh paint still lingered inside the empty house, mixing with the scent of cardboard and new hardwood flooring as sunlight poured through wide front windows. I stacked kitchen dishes beside unopened moving boxes and noticed the thick leather briefcase I had carried home from the commercial property closing. It rested exactly where I had left it the night before, still filled with signed contracts, lease assignments, title documents, and closing statements that I had planned to organize later that weekend. At the time it looked like nothing more than another routine file waiting for attention. I had absolutely no reason to believe that somewhere inside those ordinary papers rested a single document capable of turning the entire argument outside my front door completely upside down. By the following afternoon, it became painfully obvious that Victoria Holloway had no intention of treating our first encounter as a misunderstanding. Every few hours another reminder appeared at my front door. The first was a neatly printed welcome packet explaining neighborhood regulations that did not apply to my property. The second was a brightly colored notice requesting immediate Homeowners Association registration. The third informed me that my pickup truck violated approved community appearance standards because it had remained in my driveway overnight. I almost laughed when I read that one. The truck sat entirely on my own property, exactly where it had been parked since moving day. Still, I folded every notice carefully and placed them inside the same leather briefcase containing my recent closing documents. My father always believed that unnecessary paperwork often became valuable evidence if someone remained patient long enough. The neighborhood itself looked peaceful on the surface. Children rode bicycles beneath mature oak trees. Dog walkers greeted one another along perfectly maintained sidewalks. Lawn crews moved from house to house, leaving behind the familiar smell of freshly cut grass. It was the kind of place most people imagined when they dreamed about quiet suburban life. Yet every afternoon Victoria drove slowly past my house in the same white golf cart, stopping just long enough to make sure I noticed her watching. Sometimes another board member accompanied her. Sometimes she simply pointed toward my property while speaking into her phone. The message never changed. She wanted everyone to believe I was the problem. A few neighbors introduced themselves politely and welcomed me to the area, but several others kept their distance after hearing Victoria's version of events. One elderly man quietly apologized while collecting his mail. He admitted the association president usually got her way because very few residents wanted to argue with someone who seemed to know every county official, every attorney, and every local rule. I thanked him for the warning instead of asking questions. Experience had taught me that confident people often relied on reputation far more than facts. 2 mornings later I discovered a temporary sign pushed into the grass beside my driveway announcing that unresolved compliance issues were under review. It stood only a few feet from my mailbox where every passing driver could read it. I removed the sign without damaging it, photographed its exact location, and stored it inside my garage beside the growing stack of notices. Before lunchtime, Victoria appeared again, this time accompanied by 2 members of the architectural committee carrying clipboards and digital cameras. They measured landscaping, photographed my driveway, and wrote notes while standing near the sidewalk. I walked outside with a cup of coffee and asked whether they needed anything from me. Victoria answered before anyone else could speak. She said the association would continue documenting violations until I accepted community authority. I smiled politely and gave the same answer I had repeated since the first day. I am not part of your homeowners association. Her expression tightened for just a moment before returning to that practiced smile. As she drove away, I noticed something unusual. The golf cart carried a small magnetic sign advertising the Willow Creek Estates Management Office along with its business address. The location caught my attention because I recognized the street immediately. I had driven past that commercial building during my recent investment inspection. At the time, it seemed like nothing more than another ordinary office leased to another ordinary tenant. I stood quietly in my driveway watching the golf cart disappear around the corner, suddenly realizing that the address printed on its side was beginning to sound far more familiar than simple coincidence should have allowed. The following week felt less like moving into a new home and more like being quietly placed on trial without ever entering a courtroom. Every morning another envelope appeared in my mailbox carrying the Willow Creek Estates logo across the top. Some contained warnings about landscaping that had not changed. Others questioned where I parked my truck or suggested I submit architectural approval before replacing a burnt-out porch light. None of the notices had any legal effect on my property, but Victoria clearly understood that constant pressure could wear people down long before any real authority became necessary. I refused to argue. Instead, I dated every envelope, photographed every document, and filed everything inside the same leather briefcase that still held the commercial closing records I had barely reviewed. The neighborhood remained beautiful despite the growing tension. The scent of flowering crepe myrtles mixed with freshly watered lawns each evening while families gathered outside after dinner, children tossed footballs across front yards, and cyclists passed beneath rows of mature oak trees. It would have been the perfect place to slow down after years of business travel if not for the steady stream of unnecessary conflict arriving at my front door. One afternoon I decided to introduce myself to several nearby homeowners instead of letting rumors speak for me. Most were polite. A retired school principal welcomed me with homemade cookies. A young couple apologized for the uncomfortable situation and admitted they had received warnings themselves over harmless issues during previous years. The more people I met, the more I realized that Victoria's confidence came less from respect than from habit. Many residents simply found it easier to agree with her than challenge every new demand. A few days later another certified letter arrived, this time from an attorney representing the association. The letter insisted that my refusal to register violated mandatory community obligations and invited me to attend a board meeting before additional legal action became necessary. I smiled when I finished reading because one sentence immediately stood out. The meeting would take place at the Willow Creek Estates Management Center on Heritage Commerce Drive. I had seen that exact address before. Instead of attending the meeting, I drove downtown to my office and unlocked the leather briefcase from the recent commercial acquisition. The familiar smell of fresh paper and leather filled the conference room as I spread closing binders across the polished table. Hundreds of pages rested inside, including title reports, tenant estoppel certificates, rent schedules, insurance records, and lease assignments. I had trusted my legal team enough to review every technical detail before closing, so I never felt the need to study every attachment myself. That afternoon curiosity finally convinced me otherwise. I flipped slowly through page after page until I reached the section listing active commercial tenants. Coffee cooled beside my elbow while late afternoon sunlight stretched across the documents. Then my eye stopped on a familiar name. Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association Administrative Office. Suite 200. Heritage Commerce Drive. The address matched the one printed on every warning letter Victoria had sent me. My heartbeat slowed instead of speeding up because years of investing had taught me that the biggest discoveries rarely announce themselves with excitement. They appear quietly in ordinary paperwork. I leaned back in my chair and continued reading the lease assignment line by line, suddenly realizing that the argument unfolding outside my house had never been limited to neighborhood rules. Without intending to, I had just opened the first page of an entirely different story. For several minutes I read the lease assignment over and over, not because I doubted what it said, but because my mind refused to believe something so ordinary could completely change the direction of everything that had happened during the past week. The commercial building on Heritage Commerce Drive had been part of the investment portfolio I purchased. Suite 200, occupied by the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association, appeared on the tenant schedule just like every other office listed in the property. The lease had been signed years earlier with the previous owner and transferred automatically during closing. There was nothing mysterious about it. Nothing hidden. Nothing dramatic. It had simply been another line buried among hundreds of pages that nobody expected a residential disagreement to ever intersect with. I immediately called my attorney, Melissa Grant, who had supervised the acquisition from the beginning. Instead of sounding surprised, she calmly asked me to email the lease assignment, closing statement, and recorded deed. Less than an hour later she called back. Her voice carried the same careful professionalism she always used before delivering important news. She confirmed that ownership of the commercial property had transferred exactly as recorded. She also reminded me that becoming a landlord did not give me authority over the Homeowners Association itself. Their governing documents remain separate from the lease. However, she explained something equally important. The association occupied office space under a commercial lease that now belonged to me. From that moment forward, every communication regarding rent, maintenance, renewal options, and future tenancy would legally come through my office. I thanked her and asked the question that had been forming in my mind since discovering the address. Should I tell Victoria immediately? Melissa answered without hesitation. Absolutely not. Continue acting professionally. Continue documenting everything. Let the normal business process speak for itself. I followed her advice exactly. The next morning I contacted my commercial property manager and instructed him to begin introducing our company to every tenant in the newly acquired building using the same standard welcome package we mailed after every acquisition. No special treatment. No surprises. No personal messages. Just routine business correspondence explaining new ownership, payment instructions, maintenance contacts, and future communication procedures. Willow Creek Estates would receive the exact same packet as every other tenant. That afternoon another notice appeared taped to my front door accusing me of failing to attend the association board meeting. Victoria had highlighted several paragraphs with a bright yellow marker and handwritten a note stating that continued refusal to cooperate would only make matters worse. I folded the paper carefully before placing it into my growing file. Across the street several neighbors watched quietly from shaded porches while warm evening sunlight reflected across perfectly trimmed lawns. I noticed something different this time. Instead of looking uncomfortable, a few of them seemed curious. Rumors had clearly begun spreading throughout the neighborhood, although nobody yet understood the entire story. 2 days later my property manager informed me that every welcome packet had been delivered successfully, including the one addressed to the Willow Creek Estates Administrative Office. According to the delivery confirmation, someone signed for it shortly after 9 o'clock that morning. I smiled briefly before closing the email. Victoria probably believed another routine business letter had arrived with the morning mail. She had no reason to examine the sender's name closely. After all, she still believed she was dealing with nothing more than a stubborn homeowner who refused to follow neighborhood rules. She had not yet realized that our next conversation would no longer take place across my driveway. It would begin inside a landlord's office, with documents she could not simply tape to someone else's front door. The following Monday began like every other business morning in my office, with the smell of fresh coffee drifting across polished conference tables while my assistant organized lease correspondence from the newly acquired commercial properties. Nothing about the schedule seemed unusual. Routine maintenance requests. Insurance certificates. Rent confirmations. Then one email immediately caught my attention. My property manager explained that the administrative office of Willow Creek Estates had contacted him requesting clarification about the ownership transfer notice they received several days earlier. According to the receptionist, their board president insisted there had been some kind of mistake because the previous landlord had never mentioned selling the building. I simply thanked him for the update and instructed him to continue following our normal procedures. By early afternoon, another envelope appeared in my residential mailbox. Victoria had apparently decided that official letters were no longer enough. This time she personally signed a formal demand requiring me to attend the next homeowners association meeting or face additional legal action for refusing to comply with mandatory community obligations. I placed her letter beside the property management report from my office and could not help noticing how strangely similar both documents looked. Each claimed authority. Each expected immediate compliance. The difference was that only one rested upon a legal relationship that actually existed. 3 days later, Melissa called with another update after reviewing every remaining file connected to the commercial acquisition. She confirmed there were no ownership disputes, no pending litigation, and no hidden contractual problems. The lease remained fully enforceable under the exact terms negotiated years before I purchased the property. One detail immediately stood out. The agreement would reach its renewal review period in less than 3 weeks. Melissa reminded me that renewal decisions should always be based upon standard commercial considerations rather than personal disagreements. I assured her that was exactly what I intended to do. Business remained business. That Friday evening I drove past Heritage Commerce Drive on my way home. The office building looked exactly as it had during the inspection before closing. Brick exterior. Fresh landscaping. Large oak trees providing afternoon shade across the parking lot. Through the front windows I could see several employees working late inside various suites. At Suite 200, the Willow Creek Estates office remained brightly lit. Victoria stood near the reception desk speaking with 2 board members while stacks of folders covered the conference table behind them. They looked busy preparing for another community meeting, completely unaware that the building surrounding them had quietly changed ownership weeks earlier. I stayed only long enough to confirm everything appeared normal before continuing home. The weekend passed peacefully until Saturday morning when another police cruiser rolled slowly onto my street. This time the officers remained polite from the moment they stepped out of their vehicle. Victoria followed closely behind, carrying another folder filled with association documents. She explained that I had continued ignoring board directives despite repeated notices. One officer listened carefully before asking whether there had been any change since their first visit. I answered honestly. Nothing had changed regarding my property. I still was not part of the homeowners association. That statement visibly frustrated Victoria, who insisted the matter would soon be resolved through legal channels. I simply nodded because, for the first time since moving into Willow Creek, I quietly realized she was finally correct about one thing. Very soon this disagreement would indeed move into a legal setting. It just would not be the one she had spent weeks preparing for, and the documents waiting inside my office would speak far more clearly than either of us ever needed to raise our voices. The invitation to the next homeowners association meeting arrived on thick cream-colored paper with gold lettering embossed across the top, as though elegant stationery somehow made every demand more legitimate. The meeting would take place the following Thursday evening inside the Willow Creek Estates administrative office on Heritage Commerce Drive. I placed the invitation beside my calendar without making any immediate decision. Instead, I spent the next several days doing exactly what Melissa advised. I remained patient. I answered every routine business email. I approved maintenance requests from other commercial tenants. I reviewed lease renewals for several medical offices across the city. The office occupied by the Homeowners Association received the same professional attention as every other tenant under our management. Nothing more. Nothing less. On Tuesday afternoon, my property manager forwarded another message from the receptionist at the administrative office. They wanted confirmation regarding future rent payments because accounting records still listed the previous property owner. We prepared a courteous response with updated payment instructions, contact information, emergency maintenance procedures, and copies of the recorded ownership transfer already filed during closing. Every page carried our company letterhead and standard formatting. There was no mention of neighborhood disagreements. There was certainly no reference to Victoria. Business remained business. 2 days later I drove home beneath a sky filled with soft orange light as the sun settled behind rows of mature oak trees surrounding Willow Creek. The neighborhood looked almost peaceful again. Children laughed while riding bicycles along quiet streets. Neighbors watered flower beds, collected mail, and waved politely as I passed. Several residents who had once avoided eye contact now greeted me with friendly smiles. Whatever Victoria had been telling people no longer seemed quite as convincing as before. That evening another certified envelope appeared on my porch. This one announced that the board intended to discuss additional enforcement measures if I failed to appear at the upcoming meeting. I read the letter slowly before placing it inside the growing file that now contained every notice, photograph, envelope, and delivery receipt from the first day I moved into the neighborhood. Looking at the organized stack reminded me of something my father used to say whenever customers complained louder than everyone else inside his hardware store. Volume never changed the facts. Only patience uncovered them. Thursday finally arrived. I left my office slightly earlier than usual carrying a slim leather portfolio instead of the heavy briefcase that had followed me throughout the past 2 weeks. Inside rested only a few carefully arranged documents. The recorded deed for the commercial property. The executed lease assignment. The ownership transfer statement. Copies of the welcome letter already delivered to every tenant. Nothing dramatic. Nothing unnecessary. The parking lot outside the management office was already full when I arrived. Residents walked toward the entrance carrying notebooks and coffee cups while board members greeted one another beneath the building's covered entryway. Victoria stood near the front doors welcoming everyone with the same confident smile she had worn since the morning she first arrived outside my house with police officers. She noticed me almost immediately. For a brief moment satisfaction crossed her face, as though she believed weeks of pressure had finally forced me to submit. She gestured toward the conference room and politely informed everyone that the board would soon address an ongoing compliance issue involving a homeowner who refused to recognize community authority. I thanked her for the invitation and quietly followed everyone inside. As I looked around the conference room, polished wood tables reflected warm ceiling lights while framed photographs of neighborhood events decorated the walls. The office felt familiar now, not because I had visited before, but because every square foot surrounding us already appeared in the documents resting quietly inside my portfolio, waiting for exactly the right moment to speak for themselves. Victoria called the meeting to order with the same polished confidence she had displayed from the first morning we met. Residents settled into their seats while the soft hum of the air conditioning mixed with the quiet rustle of notebooks opening across the conference room. A coffee station near the entrance filled the room with the smell of freshly brewed coffee, and for a brief moment the gathering resembled any ordinary community meeting. Then Victoria looked directly at me. She explained that one homeowner had repeatedly ignored association requirements, refused multiple written notices, and declined every opportunity to cooperate with neighborhood leadership. Several board members nodded while others quietly reviewed printed agendas. I listened without interruption because every statement she made depended upon one assumption that had not yet been challenged. When she finished, she invited me to explain why I believed the association rules did not apply to my property. I stood, thanked everyone for allowing me to attend, and answered exactly the way I had since moving into Willow Creek. I said I respected communities that operated within their legal authority, but my property remained outside the recorded boundaries of the homeowners association. I also explained that I had never objected to reasonable communication. My concern had always been repeated demands based upon an authority that did not extend onto my land. Victoria immediately responded that attorneys would settle the matter if necessary. That was the moment I quietly opened the leather portfolio resting beside my chair. I removed 3 neatly organized documents and walked them across the table to the association's legal counsel before saying another word. The attorney adjusted his glasses and began reading the recorded deed first. Then he reviewed the commercial property closing statement. Finally he examined the executed lease assignment attached behind it. The room grew noticeably quieter with every page he turned. Victoria leaned toward him and asked whether the documents had anything to do with the homeowners association dispute. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he continued reading line by line before looking toward me with an expression that shifted from curiosity to recognition. He asked one simple question. Had the commercial acquisition closed exactly on the recorded date listed in the assignment documents? I nodded. He compared the signatures one final time before placing the papers carefully onto the conference table. The silence inside the room lasted several long seconds. Finally, he looked toward the board and spoke in the same calm professional tone he had maintained throughout the meeting. He explained that the administrative office occupied by the Homeowners Association was leased commercial space located inside a building that had recently changed ownership through a properly recorded transaction. According to the documents before him, the new owner of that building was sitting in the room. Several residents turned toward me almost simultaneously while others looked back at Victoria, trying to understand what they had just heard. Victoria frowned and insisted there had to be some misunderstanding because she had dealt with the previous landlord for years. The attorney gently replied that commercial property ownership changes were not unusual and that existing leases generally continued under the new owner unless otherwise provided by law or contract. He emphasized that the association remained a tenant under the existing lease and that future landlord communications would appropriately come from the new ownership. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody argued. The realization simply settled across the room, one careful sentence at a time. I closed the portfolio after the attorney finished speaking because the documents had already done everything they were ever meant to do. Facts had quietly replaced assumptions, and for the first time since arriving in Willow Creek, the room became completely silent for reasons that no amount of authority could change. Several weeks passed after that meeting, and the neighborhood slowly settled into a rhythm that felt remarkably different from the one I had first encountered. The sidewalks were still lined with perfectly trimmed hedges, children still rode bicycles beneath the oak trees every evening, and the familiar scent of fresh grass continued drifting through the warm Texas air, but something subtle had changed. Conversations became quieter and more respectful. Instead of whispered rumors, neighbors stopped to introduce themselves properly. Several admitted they had never questioned how far the Homeowners Association's authority actually extended because they simply assumed every decision had been legally correct. I never asked anyone to choose sides. I only encouraged people to read their own governing documents before accepting someone else's interpretation of them. A few days after the meeting, Victoria requested a private appointment at my office regarding the commercial lease. She arrived carrying organized folders instead of violation notices, and for the first time since we met, her tone remained completely professional. We reviewed the existing lease exactly as we would have with any other commercial tenant. There were no raised voices, no personal accusations, and no dramatic confrontations. We discussed routine maintenance responsibilities, payment procedures, and future communication. Before leaving, she acknowledged that our disagreement over my property should never have become personal. I appreciated the honesty and assured her that I had never intended to interfere with the association's legitimate responsibilities. My only expectation had always been that property rights would be respected on both sides. During the following board meeting, several previously issued notices directed toward my property were formally withdrawn after the association's attorney completed an independent review of the recorded boundary documents. The board also adopted a new policy requiring verification through county records before issuing enforcement notices involving properties located near subdivision boundaries. Watching that recommendation receive unanimous approval felt far more satisfying than winning any personal argument because it meant future homeowners would likely avoid the same experience. Life gradually returned to normal. My commercial property continued operating successfully, the association remained a reliable tenant under its existing lease, and every monthly rent payment arrived through the same ordinary accounting process used by every other business occupying the building. There were no special conditions, no unnecessary pressure, and no personal favors. Business remained business exactly as Melissa had advised from the beginning. One quiet Saturday morning I stood in my driveway with a cup of coffee while sunlight reflected across the neighborhood. The same birds that greeted me on moving day still filled the trees with familiar songs, and the breeze carried the scent of flowering shrubs instead of tension. Across the street, several neighbors waved as they walked their dogs, and even Victoria offered a polite greeting while driving past in her golf cart. We both understood something now that neither of us fully appreciated during our first encounter. Authority depends upon clearly defined boundaries, but ownership depends upon recorded facts. Those two ideas sometimes overlap, yet they are never the same thing. Looking back, I realized the police officers who visited that first morning had unknowingly witnessed the beginning of a lesson far bigger than a neighborhood disagreement. Paperwork may not seem exciting. Recorded deeds rarely attract attention. Commercial lease assignments almost never become dinner table conversation. Yet those quiet documents protected everyone's rights far more effectively than anger or assumptions ever could. As I finished my coffee and listened to the peaceful sounds of another ordinary morning, I smiled to myself because the most important victory had never been becoming anyone's landlord. It had been proving that patience, professionalism, and the truth written on the right piece of paper will always outlast the loudest claim of authority.